The demolition crew showed up at dawn like they were performing a military operation, complete with hard hats and clipboards, ready to tear down my only bridge to civilization. Victoria Pemberton stood there in her pressed pantsuit, arms crossed, watching with the satisfaction of someone who'd just won a chess match against a toddler. What she didn't know was that I'd been recording every illegal meeting, every bribe, every threat she'd made for the past 6 months. In exactly 4 hours, the FBI's Public Corruption Unit would be knocking on her door. But first, I had to survive what was about to become the longest morning of my life. My name is Garrett Mitchell, and 8 months ago I fulfilled a lifelong dream by purchasing a 100-acre ranch just outside Sterling Meadows. One of those gated communities where the grass is always green and the HOA rules are thicker than a phone book. The property had belonged to my late grandfather, who'd stubbornly refused to sell despite decades of pressure from developers. When he passed, he left it to me with one simple instruction written in his will: never let them take our land. The ranch itself was everything I'd dreamed of during 20 years of working as a software engineer in Silicon Valley. Rolling pastures dotted with ancient oak trees, a spring-fed pond that attracted wild deer at sunset, and a 2-story farmhouse that had been in our family since 1952. The only catch was the location. My property was completely surrounded by Sterling Meadows, accessible only by a narrow easement road that crossed Willow Creek via an old wooden bridge my grandfather had built in the 70s. Sterling Meadows was the kind of place where they measured your grass with actual rulers and sent you violation notices if your mailbox wasn't the approved shade of forest green. The community boasted 3 swimming pools, 6 tennis courts, a golf course, and a clubhouse that looked like it had been transplanted from a plantation. The residents were a mix of retired executives, trust fund inheritors, and new money tech entrepreneurs who thought a $700,000 house made them aristocracy. Victoria Pemberton had been HOA president for 12 years, ruling her suburban kingdom with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. She was in her early 50s, with perfectly highlighted blonde hair that never moved regardless of weather conditions, and a smile that could freeze hell over. She drove a white Mercedes SUV with a personalized plate that read, "Oh, a boss," and treated every interaction like a corporate takeover. I first met Victoria 3 days after moving in. When she showed up at my door with a welcome basket and a 100-page document she called the Community Integration Packet, she stood on my porch, examining my property with the calculating gaze of a real estate appraiser, while explaining that my ranch was technically part of the Sterling Meadows sphere of influence, despite not being within the gated community proper. "Your grandfather was quite the character," she said, her tone suggesting this wasn't a compliment. "He refused every generous offer we made over the years. I hope you'll be more reasonable about maintaining standards that benefit everyone." When I asked what standards she meant, considering I lived on a working ranch outside their gates, she launched into a speech about property values, visual cohesion, and the importance of presenting a unified community image. Apparently, my ranch's rustic appearance was visible from the Sterling Meadows golf course's 9th hole, and several members had complained that it disrupted their concentration. The real trouble started when I began making improvements to the property. I installed solar panels on the barn roof to reduce energy costs, which Victoria claimed violated the architectural consistency guidelines, even though those guidelines didn't apply to properties outside the HOA. When I pointed this out, she smiled that frozen smile and said the guidelines had recently been expanded to include adjacent properties that impact community aesthetics. Next came the livestock issue. I'd brought in a small herd of Highland cattle, those shaggy Scottish breeds that look like walking carpets. They were gentle, low maintenance, and perfect for managing the pasture grass naturally. But Victoria insisted they were a noise nuisance and potential safety hazard. Despite the fact that they were quieter than most dogs and stayed behind proper fencing, the bridge became our main battleground. It was the only access point to my property, crossing Willow Creek at a narrow point where my grandfather had negotiated an easement decades ago. The bridge was old but solid, built from heavy timber, with a weight capacity that could handle farm equipment. Victoria started complaining that the bridge was an eyesore that decreased property values for the million-dollar homes nearby. She sent me official-looking letters on HOA letterhead demanding I replace the wooden bridge with something more aesthetically pleasing, suggesting a covered bridge design that would cost at least $200,000. When I ignored the letters, she escalated to leaving violation notices on my gate, each one with increasingly absurd fines for non-compliance. Marcus Chen, who owned the house closest to my property line, became my unlikely ally. He was a retired engineer who'd moved to Sterling Meadows for the golf, but found the HOA politics exhausting. One evening, he walked over while I was repairing a fence and warned me that Victoria was planning something big. She's been holding closed-door meetings with her inner circle, Marcus said, glancing around nervously like Victoria might materialize from the bushes. I overheard her talking about condemning your bridge as a safety hazard. She's got a cousin who works for the county planning department. That night, I installed security cameras covering every angle of the bridge and the access road. If Victoria was going to play dirty, I wanted documentation. I also started researching property law and discovered that my grandfather's easement was ironclad, recorded with the county in 1971 with language that specifically prevented any homeowners association from interfering with access. The war escalated slowly over the next few months. Victoria tried new tactics every week. She organized community beautification days where volunteers would plant flowers and install decorative rocks right up to my property line, creating what she called a visual buffer zone. She hired a sound engineer to measure noise levels from my cattle, trying to build a nuisance case. She even attempted to get the creek designated as a protected watershed, which would have given her environmental grounds to challenge the bridge. Each time she failed, her tactics became more aggressive. She started scheduling HOA events on the common area nearest my property, including a wine and jazz festival that lasted until midnight, with speakers aimed directly at my house. When I complained to the police about noise violations, they apologetically explained that the HOA had obtained all the proper permits. Sandra Williams, another Sterling Meadows resident, secretly reached out to me after one of these events. She was a widow in her 70s who'd been battling Victoria for years over increasingly petty violations. Victoria had fined her $300 for having the wrong species of roses in her garden, and another $500 for a bird feeder that allegedly attracted undesirable wildlife. That woman is pure evil wrapped in Ann Taylor, Sandra whispered during our clandestine meeting at a coffee shop outside the neighborhood. She drove out the Johnsons because they put up a basketball hoop, made the Patel family remove their Hindu decorations during Diwali, and somehow got the Hernandez family's home insurance canceled over unpaid fines. Sandra showed me a folder thick with documents, evidence of Victoria's selective enforcement of rules. White families with connections got warnings for major violations, while minorities and anyone who challenged her authority got maximum fines for trivial infractions. There was a clear pattern of discrimination that went back years. She's careful, Sandra explained. Never puts anything explicitly racist in writing. But look at the statistics. Every black family that's moved in has been driven out within 2 years. The Asian families get constant violations for cultural decorations or cooking smells. Meanwhile, the Worthington's son deals drugs from their pool house and nobody says a word. I started my own investigation, filing public records requests for HOA finances and meeting minutes. What I found was a maze of questionable expenses and missing money. Victoria had been approving payments to companies that seemed to exist only on paper, including a landscaping service run by her brother-in-law that charged 3 times market rate for basic maintenance. The security cameras I'd installed began capturing interesting footage beyond just my bridge. Late-night meetings where cash changed hands, heated arguments between Victoria and residents who'd questioned her authority, and suspicious activity around the community's maintenance equipment. I backed up everything to multiple cloud servers and shared copies with a lawyer friend who specialized in HOA disputes. The morning everything changed started like any other. I was in the barn feeding the cattle when I heard the rumble of heavy machinery. Through the barn door, I saw a convoy of construction vehicles heading down the easement road toward my bridge. Leading the parade was Victoria's white Mercedes, followed by 2 police cars, a code enforcement vehicle, and 3 trucks carrying demolition equipment. I grabbed my phone and started recording as I ran toward the bridge. Victoria was already there, standing with a man in a suit who was holding official-looking documents. 2 police officers flanked them, looking uncomfortable but official. The demolition crew was already unloading equipment. "Mr. Mitchell," Victoria called out with her frozen smile wider than ever, "I'm pleased to inform you that the county has condemned your bridge as structurally unsound. For public safety, it needs to be demolished immediately." The man in the suit stepped forward. "I'm Harold Pemberton from the County Planning Department. Our engineers have determined this bridge poses an imminent hazard. You have 1 hour to remove any personal items before demolition begins." Harold Pemberton, Victoria's cousin. Just as Marcus had warned, I noticed he carefully avoided making eye contact with me while clutching his folder of undoubtedly fabricated inspection reports. "This bridge was inspected by a licensed engineer 6 months ago," I said. "Still recording. I have the certification stating it's structurally sound for another 20 years. This is clearly a coordinated attack on my property rights." Victoria's smile never wavered. Public safety takes precedence over old inspections. "The county has spoken." One of the police officers, a younger guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we're just here to keep the peace. This is a civil matter between you and the county." I pulled out my phone and made a show of scrolling through my contacts. "I understand, officer. I'm just going to call my attorney real quick. And maybe the news station that's been investigating HOA corruption. They'll definitely want to cover a controversial emergency demolition." Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "There's no need for theatrics. Mr. Mitchell, this is simply about safety." "Safety," I repeated, loud enough for everyone to hear, like when you tried to have my neighbor's wheelchair ramp removed because it didn't match the aesthetic guidelines, or when you fined the Martinez family $8,000 for displaying their Marine Corps flag. Harold Pemberton was sweating now despite the cool morning air. He kept glancing at Victoria, clearly realizing this wasn't going according to plan. The demolition crew had stopped unloading and were watching our exchange with interest. I decided to play my first card. "Officer, are you aware that destroying this bridge would trap me on my property with no legal access to public roads? That's a violation of state property law. Additionally, this easement is protected by a 1971 agreement that specifically prevents any homeowners association from interfering with access." The older police officer, whose badge read Sergeant Walker, frowned. Nobody mentioned anything about easement rights. We were told this was a simple safety demolition. "It's not simple at all," I continued, pulling up documents on my phone. "This is a coordinated effort by the HOA president to force me off my land. I have recordings of Miss Pemberton stating her intention to, quote, get rid of that eyesore ranch by any means necessary." Victoria's face turned an interesting shade of red. "Those recordings were obtained illegally. You can't record private conversations." "Actually, I can," I said calmly. "Those conversations happened at public HOA meetings. And before you claim they were executive sessions, I have the meeting minutes showing they were open to all residents." Harold Pemberton took a step back. Pulling out his phone, "I need to make a call. There might be some confusion about the inspection reports." Victoria grabbed his arm. "Don't you dare back down now. Harold, we discussed this," and there it was. The admission I'd been waiting for, captured on multiple recordings. The demolition crew chief, a burly man with Davis Demolition embroidered on his shirt, raised his hand. "Ma'am, if there's a legal dispute here, we can't proceed without clear authorization. My insurance doesn't cover lawsuits over illegal demolitions." The situation was unraveling faster than Victoria could control it. but I knew she wouldn't give up easily. This woman had ruled Sterling Meadows like a feudal lord for over a decade. She had connections, resources, and a vindictiveness that bordered on pathological. Fine. Victoria spat. We'll postpone the demolition pending further review. But this isn't over. Mitchell. That bridge is coming down one way or another. As the convoy began to retreat, I noticed Victoria making hushed phone calls. Her gestures animated and angry. The police officers lingered, and Sergeant Walker approached me. Sir, you might want to document the condition of that bridge thoroughly, he said quietly. Sometimes things happen to structures under dispute. Accidents, vandalism, that sort of thing. I thanked him for the advice and spent the rest of the day photographing every beam, bolt, and plank of the bridge. I also installed additional cameras with night vision and motion sensors. If Victoria was planning something, I'd be ready. That evening, Marcus Chen stopped by with disturbing news. Victoria had called an emergency HOA meeting and was proposing a special assessment of $50,000 per household to fund legal action against me. She claimed my ranch was depressing property values and creating a hostile environment for the community. The crazy part is, some people are buying it, Marcus said, shaking his head. She's got them convinced that your cattle are carrying diseases, and your solar panels are causing electromagnetic interference with their smart home systems. I laughed despite the situation. Electromagnetic interference? From solar panels? Hey, these are the same people who believed her when she said the Wynn family's koi pond was attracting mosquitoes carrying West Nile virus. Fear is a powerful tool. Over the next week, Victoria's campaign against me intensified. She organized protests at my gate, with residents holding signs claiming I was destroying their quality of life. She hired a drone operator to fly over my property, supposedly documenting code violations. She even had someone spread nails on the easement road, which I discovered when I got a flat tire coming home from town. But Victoria had made a crucial mistake. In her arrogance and desperation to force me out, she'd left a paper trail of corruption, discrimination, and abuse of power. Every falsified document, every discriminatory fine, every under-the-table payment to her cousin was documented in the HOA's own records. I spent an entire night compiling evidence, cross-referencing financial records with meeting minutes, comparing violation notices with demographic data, and creating a comprehensive timeline of Victoria's reign of terror. The pattern was undeniable. Systematic discrimination, financial fraud, and abuse of power going back years. Sandra Williams had been right. Victoria hadn't just been a bad HOA president. She'd been running a criminal enterprise, using her position to enrich herself and her family, while driving out anyone who didn't fit her vision of what Sterling Meadows should be. The next morning, I made several phone calls. First, to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, where I spoke with Special Agent Janet Rodriguez about the embezzlement and bribery. Next, to the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Fair Housing Division about the pattern of discrimination. Then to the State Attorney General's office about the HOA's illegal attempts to extend authority beyond their jurisdiction. Each agency was interested, but Agent Rodriguez was particularly intrigued by the financial crimes. "Send me everything you have," she said. "If even half of what you're describing is accurate, we're looking at serious federal charges." I overnight shipped copies of all my evidence to the various agencies and settled in to wait. Victoria, meanwhile, was preparing for war. She'd convinced the HOA board to hire a high-powered law firm to pursue legal action against me. She spread rumors that I was planning to turn my ranch into a commercial operation that would bring traffic and crime to their exclusive community. 3 days after I'd contacted the authorities, Victoria made her biggest move yet. I woke to the sound of chainsaws and rushed outside to find a crew cutting down trees along the easement road. Victoria stood there with another official-looking document, claiming the trees posed a safety hazard to vehicles accessing my property. "You can't do this," I said, recording everything. "Those trees are on my property. not the easement. Victoria's smile was triumphant. Actually, according to the new survey we commissioned, the property line runs right through the middle of these trees. We're simply removing the portions that encroach on HOA common area. It was brilliant in its maliciousness. By cutting the trees, she was making the easement road more visible from Sterling Meadows. Strengthening her argument about visual impact, she was also destroying the natural barrier that gave my ranch privacy from the development. But as the chainsaws roared and sawdust filled the air, I noticed something Victoria had missed. 3 black SUVs were approaching down the main road, followed by 2 local police cars and a van marked FBI Evidence Response Team. Victoria was so focused on her tree-cutting spectacle that she didn't notice the vehicles until they'd pulled up behind her Mercedes. Special Agent Rodriguez stepped out. Accompanied by several other agents and uniformed officers, she was holding a thick folder of warrants. "Victoria Pemberton?" Agent Rodriguez called out over the sound of the chainsaws. Victoria turned, her triumphant smile freezing as she took in the scene. The chainsaw operators, sensing something significant was happening, shut off their equipment. In the sudden silence, Agent Rodriguez's voice carried clearly. "I'm Special Agent Rodriguez with the FBI. We have warrants for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and violations of the Fair Housing Act. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked around Victoria's wrists, her carefully composed facade finally shattered completely. She looked at me with pure hatred, then started screaming accusations. I was a plant, a government spy sent to destroy their perfect community. I had fabricated evidence and turned her own family against her. The liberal deep state was targeting successful communities like Sterling Meadows. Harold Pemberton, who had been supervising the tree cutting, tried to slip away quietly, but was stopped by 2 agents. Turned out the FBI was very interested in his role in creating false inspection reports and accepting bribes. The arrest of Sterling Meadows' HOA president was just the beginning of an investigation that would reveal years of corruption, discrimination, and financial crimes. But at that moment, as I watched Victoria being led away in handcuffs, all I felt was relief. My bridge was safe. My ranch was secure. And the woman who had terrorized an entire community was finally facing justice. The chainsaw crew packed up their equipment and left, mumbling apologies about not knowing the situation. Several Sterling Meadows residents had gathered to watch the spectacle, including Marcus Chen and Sandra Williams, who was openly crying tears of joy. "I've waited 12 years to see this," Sandra said, clutching Marcus's arm. 12 years of that woman making our lives miserable. As the FBI vehicles departed with Victoria and Harold in custody, I noticed something interesting. Several residents who had participated in Victoria's protests against me were now approaching hesitantly. One woman, who had held a sign claiming my cattle were a health hazard, stepped forward. "Mr. Mitchell, I owe you an apology," she said. "Victoria told us you were planning to build a waste treatment plant. She said your grandfather had sold you the land specifically to destroy our property values. We should have questioned her, but she was so convincing." Over the next hour, more truth came out. Victoria had been lying about me from the start, creating elaborate stories about my supposed plans to industrialize the ranch. She'd shown doctored photos of commercial farming operations, claiming they were my development plans. She'd even created fake social media profiles pretending to be me, posting inflammatory comments about Sterling Meadows residents. The depth of her deception was staggering, but it made sense. Victoria had ruled through fear and misinformation for so long that it had become her default strategy. When faced with someone she couldn't control through normal HOA channels, she'd simply escalated her tactics to criminal levels. That evening, as the sun set over my ranch, I stood on my old wooden bridge and appreciated its solid construction. My grandfather had built it to last, just like he'd built our family's legacy on this land. Victoria had tried to tear both down, But she'd failed to understand something fundamental about people like us who worked the land. We're patient, we're stubborn, and we keep very good records. The FBI investigation would continue for months, unraveling a web of corruption that extended far beyond Sterling Meadows. But for now, I had what I wanted: peace on my ranch, justice for my neighbors, and a bridge that would stand for another generation. As I headed back to the house, my phone rang. It was Agent Rodriguez with an update. They'd found evidence of Victoria's crimes going back 15 years, including connections to similar schemes at 3 other HOA communities. The investigation was expanding, and they might need me to testify before a grand jury. I told her I'd be happy to help however I could. After all, someone had to stand up to people like Victoria Pemberton. As my grandfather used to say, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Well, I'd done something, and while it had been a long, difficult road, the view from my side of the bridge had never looked better. The week following Victoria's arrest was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Each revelation triggered another, and soon the entire power structure of Sterling Meadows was crumbling. The FBI had seized Victoria's home computer, and what they found there was a goldmine of criminal evidence spanning over a decade. Agent Rodriguez called me 3 days after the arrest with an update that made my jaw drop. "Mr. Mitchell, we've uncovered evidence of a much larger conspiracy. Victoria Pemberton wasn't just embezzling from one HOA. She was part of a network that targeted affluent communities across 3 states. It turned out Victoria had connections to a consulting firm called Community Excellence Solutions, which specialized in helping people get elected to HOA boards once in power. These plants would systematically loot the associations through inflated contracts, bogus assessments, and strategic lawsuits designed to force out residents who asked too many questions. But while the FBI was building their federal case, I had more immediate problems. Victoria's most loyal supporters in Sterling Meadows weren't giving up without a fight. Led by Diane Worthington, whose husband owned a chain of luxury car dealerships, they formed what they called the Committee to Restore Sterling Values. Diane showed up at my gate one morning with a camera crew and a prepared statement. She was everything Victoria had been: polished, entitled, and absolutely convinced of her own righteousness. But where Victoria had been cold and calculating, Diane was theatrical and prone to emotional outbursts. "This man," she declared, pointing at me dramatically, "has destroyed our community's leadership through false accusations and government manipulation." Victoria Pemberton dedicated 12 years of her life to making Sterling Meadows the premier community it is today. I leaned against my gate, arms crossed, letting her rant. The camera operator looked bored, probably some local freelancer she'd hired to make this look official. When she finally paused for breath, I spoke up. "Diane, are you aware that Victoria stole over $300,000 from the HOA, or that she specifically targeted minority families with excessive fines to force them out?" Diane's face contorted with rage. Lies spread by jealous people who couldn't afford to live here legitimately. Victoria maintained standards. If people can't follow simple rules, they shouldn't buy homes they can't properly maintain. And there it was, the ugly truth beneath Sterling Meadows' manicured surface. It wasn't just about Victoria. She'd cultivated a culture where discrimination was dressed up as maintaining standards, where theft was justified as necessary for the greater good. Marcus Chen had been documenting Diane's group's activities, and what he showed me was disturbing. They were holding secret meetings, collecting money for Victoria's legal defense, and planning what they called Operation Restoration. Their goal was to make my life so miserable that I'd sell the ranch and leave. The harassment started small. Anonymous calls to animal control claiming my cattle were diseased. Reports to the health department about non-existent sewage issues. Someone even called the DEA, claiming I was growing marijuana in my barn. Each complaint required inspections, paperwork, and wasted time. But Diane's group made a critical error. They assumed I was just some tech guy playing farmer who would fold under pressure. They didn't know I'd spent 20 years in Silicon Valley dealing with corporate sharks who made suburban HOA bullies look like angry toddlers. I decided it was time to flip the script. If they wanted to play hardball, I'd give them a taste of their own medicine, legally. Of course. The easement road that crossed my property to reach Sterling Meadows had always been a free passage. My grandfather had granted it in good faith, assuming neighbors would be reasonable people, but there was nothing in the legal agreement that prevented me from installing improvements to the road, including a toll system. I hired a traffic engineering firm to design a state-of-the-art automated toll collection system. The gates would be solar-powered. With cameras that could read license plates and automatically bill residents, I set the rates at $20 per vehicle each way. With discounts for residents who hadn't participated in harassment campaigns against me, the construction took 2 weeks. I made sure everything was legal, getting all necessary permits and following every regulation to the letter. The county actually supported the project, since I agreed to share 30% of the toll revenue for road maintenance. The morning I activated the toll system was glorious. Diane Worthington was the first victim, pulling up to the gate in her white Range Rover at 7 a.m. for her morning tennis match. She sat there for 10 minutes, honking and screaming, before finally paying the $40 round-trip fee. By noon, my phone was ringing off the hook. The remaining HOA board members were threatening lawsuits, claiming I was holding the community hostage. Local news crews showed up, eager to cover the story of the rancher who'd turned the tables on an abusive HOA. Sandra Williams stopped by that afternoon, tears of laughter streaming down her face. "Garrett, you're a genius. Diane just posted a rant on the community Facebook page, claiming you're worse than Victoria ever was." The comments are brutal. People are pointing out that Victoria never charged them $40 to leave their own neighborhood. But the best part was the toll system's reporting features. Every transaction was logged, creating a perfect record of who was coming and going. When the DEA showed up for the third bogus marijuana complaint, I showed them the logs, proving the anonymous caller had driven past my property 6 times that day, clearly casing the ranch. The agent looked at the evidence and shook his head. "Mr. Mitchell, filing false reports is a federal crime. Would you like to press charges?" I declined, but made sure word got around Sterling Meadows that the next false report would result in prosecution. The harassment calls dropped off dramatically after that. Meanwhile, the FBI investigation was expanding rapidly. They'd frozen Victoria's assets, including several offshore accounts in the Caymans containing over $2 million. The money trail led to dozens of HOAs across the country, all connected through Community Excellence Solutions. Agent Rodriguez asked me to review financial records from Sterling Meadows, looking for patterns I might recognize. What I found was shocking even to me. Victoria hadn't just been stealing money. She'd been systematically devaluing certain properties through targeted harassment, then having shell companies buy them at reduced prices. The Johnsons, who'd been driven out over the basketball hoop, had sold their home for $200,000 below market value to a company called Premier Property Solutions. That company was owned by Victoria's brother-in-law, who'd flipped it 3 months later for a massive profit. The pattern repeated over and over. Minority families or anyone who challenged Victoria would face escalating fines and harassment until they sold at a loss to one of her connected buyers. It was residential redlining dressed up as HOA enforcement. I compiled my findings into a detailed report for the FBI, but also shared copies with the residents of Sterling Meadows. The community meeting that followed was explosive. Even some of Victoria's former supporters couldn't deny the evidence. Diane Worthington tried to defend her friend, claiming Victoria had been keeping out undesirable elements, but when pressed to define undesirable, she fell back on the same coded language about property values and community standards. "Let me get this straight," Marcus Chen said, standing up at the meeting. "You're saying Victoria stealing our money and driving out our neighbors based on race was acceptable because property values went up?" The room erupted in arguments. Long-buried resentment came pouring out. Residents who'd been too afraid to speak up before shared stories of Victoria's abuse. A young couple revealed they'd almost divorced over the stress of constant HOA violations. An elderly man admitted he'd sold his deceased wife's jewelry to pay bogus fines. Through it all, Diane and her shrinking group of supporters insisted this was all a misunderstanding, that Victoria had been protecting their investments. It was like watching people defend a cult leader, even as the evidence of abuse piled up around them. The breaking point came when someone leaked Victoria's personal emails to the media. The messages were damning: racial slurs, detailed plans to target specific families, jokes about making residents cry at meetings. One email to Diane Worthington specifically mentioned maintaining the proper demographic balance by pricing out certain families through fines. Diane's husband, clearly seeing the writing on the wall, publicly distanced himself from his wife's committee. Other supporters quietly melted away, suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere. Within a week, Diane was isolated, still ranting about community standards to anyone who would listen. The toll revenue, meanwhile, was adding up nicely. I used the money to improve the easement road, adding better lighting and drainage. I also set up a fund to help reimburse residents who'd been unfairly fined by Victoria's regime. It was poetic justice. The same people who'd supported her harassment were now funding reparations for her victims. Some residents grumbled about the tolls, but most adapted quickly. A few even thanked me for taking a stand. One woman told me she'd been planning to move after years of Victoria's abuse, but seeing someone finally fight back had given her hope. The FBI case against Victoria proceeded rapidly. She was denied bail after prosecutors argued she was a flight risk with significant offshore assets. Her lawyer tried to paint her as a dedicated community volunteer who'd made some bookkeeping errors, but the evidence was overwhelming. Community Excellence Solutions was raided by federal agents, revealing a nationwide conspiracy involving dozens of HOAs and millions in stolen funds. The investigation made national news, with Sterling Meadows becoming the poster child for HOA corruption. 3 months after Victoria's arrest, her trial began. I was called as a witness, spending 2 days on the stand detailing her campaign against my ranch. The prosecution used my documentation to establish a pattern of corruption and discrimination going back years. Victoria sat at the defense table looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her perfect hair was gone, replaced by a simple ponytail. The designer suits had given way to conservative courtroom attire, but her eyes still held that cold anger whenever she looked at me. During cross-examination, her lawyer tried to paint me as a vengeful neighbor who'd orchestrated her downfall over a petty property dispute. But when he brought up the bridge incident, I was ready. "Let me understand," I said calmly. "Your client tried to illegally demolish my only access to public roads, used her cousin in county government to create false inspection reports, and hired crews to cut down my trees without permission. And you think I'm the vengeful one?" The jury wasn't buying the defense's narrative. Witness after witness testified about Victoria's discrimination, theft, and abuse of power. Former residents flew in from across the country to share their stories. By the end, even her lawyer looked defeated. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Victoria Pemberton was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of over $4 million. As they led her away in handcuffs, she turned to glare at me one last time. I met her gaze steadily, thinking about all the families she'd destroyed over the years. Sterling Meadows held elections for a new HOA board, with Marcus Chen elected president on a platform of transparency and reform. The first thing he did was revoke all of Victoria's special rules and eliminate the appearance standards that had been used to discriminate against residents. Diane Worthington sold her house and moved away, still muttering about declining property values. The irony was that property values actually went up once word spread that Sterling Meadows was no longer run like a fascist state. Families who'd been scared away by the HOA's reputation started moving in, bringing fresh energy to the community. I kept the toll system in place but reduced the rates to $5 per trip, just enough to maintain the road and fund community improvements. Some residents grumbled, but most acknowledged it was fair given what I'd been through. The ranch thrived in the newfound peace. My Highland cattle grew fat and happy. The solar panels generated clean energy, and the old wooden bridge stood strong despite Victoria's attempts to destroy it. I even started hosting community events, inviting Sterling Meadows residents to experience actual ranch life. The FBI investigation continued to ripple outward, taking down corrupt HOA boards across the country. Community excellence solutions, executives were arrested, and new federal regulations were proposed to prevent HOA abuse. Victoria's case became a cautionary tale taught in law schools and real estate programs. A year later, on a quiet Sunday morning, I stood on my grandfather's bridge, watching the sunrise over Willow Creek. The water flowed peacefully below, carrying away the memories of conflict and corruption. Sterling Meadows had become what it always should have been, a community where neighbors looked out for each other instead of looking for violations. Marcus stopped by later that morning for coffee, a regular tradition we'd started. We sat on my porch, watching the cattle graze, both of us marveling at how much had changed. "You know," Marcus said, "I used to hate looking at this ranch from the golf course. Not because it was ugly, but because it reminded me of what Sterling Meadows had lost. That sense of community, of being connected to the land and each other." I nodded, understanding completely. Victoria turned neighbor against neighbor, made everyone suspicious and afraid. She convinced people that conformity was more important than character. "Never again," Marcus said firmly. "We've added term limits, financial oversight, and an elected ethics committee. No one person will ever have that much power again." As he left, I walked back to the bridge one more time. It stood as solid as ever, a testament to my grandfather's craftsmanship and values. He'd built it to last. Just like he'd built our family's connection to this land, Victoria had tried to tear both down. But she'd failed to understand something fundamental. You can't destroy integrity with intimidation, and you can't buy justice with stolen money. The ranch was safe, the community was healing, and the bridge that had started it all continued to span Willow Creek, connecting not just two pieces of land but two different ways of life. In the end, that connection had saved us all. Standing there in the morning light, I couldn't help but smile. Victoria was serving hard time in federal prison. Her network of corruption had been dismantled, and Sterling Meadows had learned a valuable lesson about the price of looking the other way. As for me, I had what I'd always wanted, a peaceful ranch where I could live my dreams without some petty dictator trying to control every aspect of my life. The cattle lowed softly in the distance, the creek gurgled beneath the bridge, and somewhere in Sterling Meadows, people were living their lives free from the fear of arbitrary fines and discriminatory enforcement. It had been a long, difficult journey, but justice had finally prevailed. And the toll booth? It stood as a reminder that sometimes the best defense against bullies isn't to build higher walls, it's to make them pay for their aggression. One trip at a time. That evening, as the Patels and others headed home, I stood once more on my grandfather's bridge. The solid wooden planks had witnessed so much: attempted destruction, federal raids, and ultimately, justice. But more importantly, they'd supported the footsteps of a community learning to heal. Marcus joined me, leaning against the railing. "You know, Garrett, when you first moved in, I thought you were crazy to take on Victoria. I'd seen too many people try and fail." "What changed your mind?" I asked. He smiled. "You didn't just fight back. You documented everything. Used the system against her. And most importantly, you helped the rest of us find our courage. Victoria ruled through fear, but you showed us that bullies only have the power we give them." As the sun set over Sterling Meadows, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I thought about the journey from that first confrontation to now. The ranch was thriving. The community was stronger, and the bridge that Victoria had tried so hard to destroy had become a symbol of resilience. The HOA still existed, but it was a different organization, entirely transparent, fair, and focused on actual community benefit rather than control. We'd even partnered with a legal aid organization to help other communities identify and combat HOA corruption. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Rodriguez. The Community Excellence Solutions investigation had resulted in over 200 arrests nationwide. HOA reform legislation was moving through Congress. What had started with one corrupt president trying to destroy a bridge had sparked a national movement for accountability. I smiled, pocketing my phone. My grandfather would have been proud. He'd built this bridge to last, and in defending it, I'd helped build something even more enduring, a community based on justice rather than fear, inclusion rather than exclusion, and neighbors who looked out for each other rather than looking for violations. The cattle were settling in for the night. The creek continued its endless journey to the sea, and somewhere in a federal prison, Victoria Pemberton was learning what it felt like to live under someone else's rules. It was a fitting end to a story that had begun with petty tyranny and ended with profound change. As I headed back to the house, I paused to pat the toll booth that had played such a crucial role in turning the tables. It would stay there as long as I owned the ranch, not as a source of revenue anymore, but as a reminder that sometimes the best way to fight injustice is to make it inconvenient for the unjust. The bridge stood strong, the ranch prospered, and Sterling Meadows had finally become the community it always should have been.